And here we go. So we're going to look at the screen, and here comes Joanne. Okay, so the subject tonight is actually hair coverings for married women. Actually, I think I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and we can. I'm just curious as to, do any of you have experience? Probably not. Well, maybe if you've lived in a Hasidic in an Orthodox, or I guess in some, well, we'll see, some conservative communities practice this. But do you have any experience with head coverings for married women in your world? Yeah, Alan
Yes.
and Cheryl.
Cheryl.
Look, I live a couple of miles from Muncie, New York.
Oh, so that's big,
And,
big
come on,
time.
one of the biggest Hasidic enclaves around here. I mean, you got to be careful when you go into that neighborhood. You could get
Well, I
pelted
would say,
with stones.
sorry.
No, I mean, you could get pelted with stones if
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I go up there and I don't wear a skirt, but I'm always careful that I'm, covered.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
yeah, I
Are
mean, you're
your
not
elbows covered?
Yeah, they don't care about your legs. They only care about your arms.
yeah.
Yeah. We know about that.
Okay. So
I mean,
it's
my
actually.
son once went to do a Hasidic wedding. He was hired as an extra camera on a Hasidic wedding, and he went only with a short sleeve black t-shirt and black pants. And I said, "What were you thinking?" But they accepted him because they saw his height and his Magen David, and he has a beard. So they just assumed he was kind of like one of those, more modern New Age Jews. So it was okay that his elbows were showing.
So actually, that's an interesting question. I have to say I'm unaware of an issue there. Is that for men also? You should, in the traditional world, you don't have your arm showing?
Up in Muncie, you would
Oh.
never see a man with his arms exposed.
Oh, that's very
They're all
interesting.
wearing black coats, they're covered. And even if they're wearing the short black pants with the white hose up to their knees, they're still covered.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so now let's jump into this. Go ahead. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Not substantial, but I'm aware that I'm involved with the Hartman Institute in Israel and in New York, and there's a large amount of teachers are modern Orthodox, and I become conscious of headbands for women and hats, and I don't know anything beyond that, but they definitely always have. So it seems like a gesture for modern Orthodox women. The ones I know is that if they just have a headband, not necessarily a full or a wig or any of the more extensive coverage, that's how they adhere to the practice of having some part of their hair being covered.
Yeah, so the interesting question would be that the headband be and the hat be a sign that they're wearing a wig? And we're going to talk about wigs.
Okay.
Because some wigs are pretty good and hard to tell that they're wigs, and others are easier to tell. Okay, so let's jump into the article. And Henry, would you like to begin reading hair coverings for married women?
Sure. In why some Orthodox women cover their hair, whether with wigs, hats, or scarves. In many traditional Jewish communities, women wear head coverings after marriage. This practice takes many different forms: hats, scarves, and wigs, often referred to as shestles.
Shadels.
Shadels.
No, shadels, yes.
Shadels. Okay. All cover and reveal different lengths of hair. Many women only don the traditional covering when entering or praying in a synagogue, and so others have rejected hair covering altogether. What is the basis for this Jewish practice, and what are some of the legal and social reasons for its variations?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed, actually from my sort of early days in Jewish consciousness, is in the conservative world, women would wear like not really a yarmulke or a kippah, but some
Hmm.
little covering over their head.
Hmm.
And of course, in the Ashkenazi world with Orthodox women, the hair is very much covered. And as Sonia has, reported to me, in Morocco, women might wear a scarf or something, but it doesn't even pretend to be covering all the hair. So there's quite a range of variation, and we're going to see some of the discussion of that. So let's continue, Henry.
Where this practice comes from. The origin of the tradition lies in the Sota ritual, a ceremony described in the Bible that tests the fidelity of a woman accused of adultery. According to the Torah, the priest uncovers or unbraids the accused women's hair as part of the humiliation that precedes the ceremony, and that's from Numbers 5:18. From this, the Talmud concludes that under normal circumstances, hair covering is a biblical requirement for women.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone, if you're all familiar with this Sota ritual, which clearly is no longer practiced because there's no temple. But if a husband actually is very jealous and suspects his wife of adultery, there's this very complicated procedure that the woman goes to the temple, and offering is placed in her arms, and they take some earth and they mix it with water, and she has to ingest it, and then if she has this dramatic gastrointestinal reaction where her belly distends and I think her thighs sag, that's a sign of her guilt, and otherwise she's innocent. And I always have to say, in the back of my mind, it was a way to get to make peace in the home and get women off the hook, because I'm guessing now as a scientist that this would never happen. It's certainly not quickly. So every woman, and I don't know, I have no idea whether this was used or to what extent it was used, but presumably every woman would get off the hook. But also what I didn't realize, and it's not a major part of the ceremony, but part of it is the priest uncovers her hair, and again, depending on how you read the Hebrew, may unbraid it. So since he's uncovering her hair, the implication is that normally her hair would not be uncovered. So that's what the Talmud says. Now we're going to look at the Mishnah.
The Mishnah in Ketubah 7:6, however, implies that hair covering is not an obligation of biblical origin. It discusses behaviors that are grounds for divorce, such as appearing in public with loose hair, weaving in the marketplace, and talking to any man, and calls these violations of Dat Yehudit, which means Jewish rule, as opposed to Dat Moshe, Mosaic rule. This categorization suggests that hair covering is not an absolute obligation originating from Moses at Sinai, but rather is a standard of modesty that was defined by the Jewish community.
Yeah, in Jewish law, there's always this discussion of whether the laws are actually from the Bible or from the Torah, or whether they're rabbinic in origin. And I don't know if that's what they're referring to here in Dat Yehudit. Dat means law, Yehudit is Jewish. So Dat Yehudit would be Jewish law, as opposed to Dat Moshe, Mosaic law. But evidently what they're saying, we'll see more of this, that it's more of a custom rather than a hard and fast biblical law.
Having first suggested that hair covering is a biblical requirement rooted in the Sota ritual, and then proposing that it is actually a product of communal norms, the Talmud, Ketubah 72, presents a compromise position. Minimal hair covering is a biblical obligation, while further standards of how and when to cover one's hair are determined by the community.
So I'll just make two comments. We've seen both Mishnah and Talmud from a tractate called Ketubot, and so you'll recognize the word Ketubah in that title. So this is a tractate of Talmud dealing with issues of marriage. And then this is a classic rabbinic out which is, you're right. How can you both be right? Well, you're right too. It's basically you're both right. Covering a little bit of hair is biblical. Covering more hair becomes a communal norm. Yeah, Alan.
So you started, I just realized, by saying the tradition is based on the soda practice from the Bible.
That's what this article is suggesting. Yes.
But I would have thought, now that I'm thinking about it, I thought it was related to that those other verses that relate to do with modesty.
Yeah. So it doesn't, and that's actually an interesting point. And I don't remember whether these articles cover it, and I don't remember what actually is in the Bible relating to modesty. So, for example, it's actually a very good question. So, we were even discussing before we got started reading the article about covering your arms and wearing long skirts and so on. And so I don't think any of those, my memory doesn't suggest that any of those details are actually biblical. I think modesty is a Jewish value, and I don't actually know, where in the Bible that value is attributed. But yeah, I don't find in any of these articles that, well, we're going to see it's the connection with the Song of Songs, which is in the next paragraph. So that's going to make to at least connect to sexuality. You can continue, Henry, if you like.
Okay. Elsewhere in the Talmud,
Berachot.
the rabbis define hair as sexually erotic.
So the Hebrew word is erva, and erva is nakedness. That we see actually in Leviticus, don't uncover the nakedness of your mother and don't uncover it. So it's a reference to eros.
Okay. And prohibit men from praying in sight of a woman's hair. The rabbis base this estimation on a biblical verse. Your hair is like a flock of goats, from Song of Songs 4:1, suggesting that this praise reflects the sensual nature of hair. However, it is significant to note that in this biblical context, the lover also praises his beloved's face, which the rabbis do not obligate women to cover. Though not all would agree, the late medieval German commentator Mordecai ben Hillel Hakahen, known as the Mordecai, explains that these rabbinic definitions of modesty, even though they are derived from a biblical verse, are based on subjective communal norms that may change with time.
And of course, this reference, and the Song of Songs, we studied it in great detail. And if anyone's interested, I think, I don't recall if I even have that on my website, or you can look on my YouTube channel. We had maybe 3 or 4 sessions. There's a lot of the lovers' description of each other, and it's interesting that the Talmud fixes on one, that your hair is like a flock of goats. Not a compliment I would dare to use in modern times. But there's also other references to the beloved's face, to her teeth, and so on. But that doesn't, I'm not aware of any Jewish communities where the face is covered. Of course, we're very familiar that in some Muslim lands, there's greater and lesser restrictions on showing the face. And I'm not sure where that comes from specifically in Islam. But it's also interesting too, that my knowledge of Islam is that the degree to which a woman's face must be covered is also a communal norm. So we know, like in Afghanistan and the Taliban will have very restrictive coverings. In Morocco, I would say and I've spent a lot of time in Morocco, I would say I rarely saw anyone with her whole face covered. You would very commonly see women's hair covered and occasionally her mouth, but rarely just a slit for the eyes. Whereas when I spent a little time in Egypt, I would see a lot more of that. So it's It is definitely communal, and it was also true in Morocco that when we would go to the beach in Morocco, we would see, Muslim families, some of which where the women were completely covered, and some of which where the women were in bikinis. And they didn't have what you might expect to find in Iran, where you have like the modesty police looking for people, and believe me, these people would not be hard to find. Yeah. So Alan, you're noting. I recall the reason men and women can't pray together is related to modesty. A woman would distract men. Yes. And so I think that's and give them impure thoughts. Yeah, I don't know about him. Yeah, I would say distraction. I guess it's presumed that the distraction would lead to impure thoughts. But in a way, just not seeing a woman's hair, is part of that.
If I can just add that Rabbi Mordecai Finley, I think his name is, who's a gay man, once told a story about how he's amused that he gets to hang around with men that he's attracted.
It's definitely not Mordecai Finley. I know Mordecai Finley very well, and he is not gay.
Oh, then it was somebody else. But it was a gay rabbi, and he was trying to, I don't want to say make fun of, but illustrate the gender aspect of this separation.
Right. There is no question it's gendered. And, as a slight digression, the very first, and actually to date, my only rabbinic ruling of law was issued just a few days after I became a rabbi, when I had a woman in my congregation, actually the president of my congregation, a gay woman whose partner, who I ultimately married the two of them later, was converting, and she was going to a mikvah. And, the rules of the mikvah is a man cannot be, a man cannot be a witness for a woman immersing, and vice versa, even if they're married, for reasons presumably of modesty. And so I had this interesting situation which presented itself, at least to me, which is, should I allow this woman who is president of my congregation to be a witness for her lover's immersion? And I ruled against her being a witness. And with my reasoning was that the rules, exactly what you're pointing to, Alan, that the fact that they do have a sexual relationship governs rather than gender. And it was interesting because she was angry at me, but a few days later actually sent me a note or called me to say that she completely changed her mind and she appreciated it, which was a relief for me. And many years later, in a discussion I had with Elliot Dorff, who is, certainly the best legal mind in Judaism that I know, maybe in the world, he said he would have ruled the same way. So that made me feel a lot better. Henry.
Yeah, just on a slight divergent there. That's the same thing with certain groups about hearing women sing, right?
Yes. So again, I would say generally in the Orthodox world, I don't know if this is true in modern Orthodox, but it's certainly true in Hasidic, Chabad world. And I'm guessing it's true in the world in Muncie, that a woman cannot sing in the presence of men. And I think it's the same idea that presumably the sound of a woman singing would just drive us into uncontrollable lust. Alan, are you raising your hand, affirming that a woman singing would drive
I wanted to add,
uncontrollable lust?
I'm agreeing with that, but I wanted to add something. The women of the wall in the court case with the court in Israel ruled that women can pray in public and sing in public. However, having said that, as you may know, if you follow the controversy, the rabbinic authorities over the Haredim in the Kotel, they fight that by drowning out the sound by playing loud speakers. But nevertheless, we know that our friends in the Women of the Wall are not discouraged by doing what they can do legally.
Right. So again, that's an issue of the clash between civil law and religious law in Israel. And I actually remember, I don't know if this ever went anywhere, but at one time there was controversy about whether a woman could chant the blessings over Shabbat candles in front of her family if there were men in the room.
In Orthodox, you mean, not,
And yeah, of course.
how
Yeah,
about
yeah.
conservative? Would that be okay in conservative?
I don't think there's any restriction on a woman singing in the conservative world. And the main example of that is that there are female cantors in the conservative world.
And rabbis.
And rabbis, yes.
Hmm.
Okay, historically speaking.
Historically speaking, women in the Talmudic period likely did cover their hair, as is attested in several anecdotes in rabbinic literature. For example, Baba Kama relates an anecdote of a woman who brings
Anecdote, actually.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
An anecdote of a woman who brings a civil suit against a man who caused her to uncover her hair in public. The judge appears to side with the woman because the man violated a social norm. Another vignette in the Talmud describes a woman whose 7 sons all served as high priest. When asked how she merited such sons, she explained that even the walls of her home never saw her hair. That's from Yoma 47. The latter story is a story of extreme piety, surpassing any law or communal consensus. The former case may also relay as historical fact a practice and summarily does not necessarily reflect religious obligation.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me. The former case, where there's a case in the civil suit, is interesting in that we don't have much history or description as to what life was like during these periods of time. I mean, there was it is surprising for me. It was actually shocking to learn that basically no one was interested in Jewish history until very, very late. Josephus actually wrote some history, but we're talking in the 1800s is when people actually sit down and start writing histories of the Jews. But in the Talmud, there's all these cases, and the cases give you insight into what was going on during that period. Okay, Henry, let's finish this section.
Okay. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish authorities reinforced the practice of covering women's hair based on the obligation derived from the Sota story. Maimonides does not include hair covering in his list of the 613 commandments, but he does rule that leaving the house without a chador, what's that?
I would say
Chador.
chador, although I'm not sure how we.
Chador.
Okay. The communal standard of modesty in Arabic countries is grounds for divorce. That's in the Laws of Marriage 24:12. The Shulchan Aruch records that both married and unmarried women should cover their hair in public. Yet the Ashkenazic rulings emphasize that this obligation relates only to married women. The Zohar further entrenches the tradition by describing the mythical importance of women making sure that not a single hair is exposed.
Let's move on to the modern era. I know, Joanne, you always volunteer, so I'm going to ask if anyone else would like to volunteer, or we'll turn to Joanne. Would anyone else like to read? Going once.
Okay.
Okay.
Today in most conservative and reform communities, women do not cover their hair on a daily basis, though in some synagogues, women will still cover their heads during prayer. A reform responsum declares, "We Reform Jews object vigorously to this requirement for women, which places them in an inferior position and sees them primarily in a sexual role." Both the conservative and reform movements allow, and in some cases encourage, women to cover their hands when praying or learning Torah because of the requirement to wear a kippah. These rulings take head covering out of the realm of female sexual modesty and instead define it as ritual practice. For men and women alike, that signifies respect and awareness of God above.
Yeah, and as I often say, I get asked this all the time, it is unclear where and when and how the practice of men wearing a kippah arose. It is definitely not in the Bible. It is not in the Talmud. There's some medieval discussions of a rabbi describing people covering their hair, men, wearing a skull cap, and he's saying, I don't. This medieval authority is saying, I don't know where this ruling arises from, but this is what they're doing. So who am I to stop them? So it seems like definitely more of a custom than anything else. But I absolutely see many women wearing head coverings in the Reform world, and I don't get around that much in the conservative world.
Google says Shulchan Aruch. It was codified. It says it happened earlier, but that of course would have been, and if
I would actually, if you have a particular reference to it, put it in the chat, because I looked hard for that and I haven't seen it. So that would be
okay. I'll see if
okay. So, Joanne, you want to continue? I think in the contemporary.
Yeah, in the contemporary Orthodox world, most rabbis consider hair covering an obligation incumbent upon all married women. However, there is variation in the form from this takes. Some maintain that women must cover all their hair. For example, the Mishnah Berurah forbids a man from praying in front of his wife if any of her hair is showing. Read its Yelp for
that's just a link to a different article.
Oh, okay. All right. Other Orthodox rabbinic figures have suggested that hair is no longer defined as erotic in our day and age because most women in society do not cover their hair in public. Based on this logic, the Aruch HaShulchan concludes that men are no longer prohibited from praying in the presence of a woman's hair, and Ray Moshe Feinstein ruled that women may show a hand's breadth of hair. A few Orthodox rabbis in the early 20th century justified women's decisions not to cover their hair at all, including the Moroccan chief rabbi in the 1960s, Harav Mashash, and the lesser-known American modern Orthodox rabbi, Isaac Hurwitz. Though they drew criticism for this opinion in their writings, they systematically review the sources surveyed above and demonstrate that those sources describe a social norm of modest dress, but not a legal requirement. Now that all women agree, Rabbi Mashash wrote that covering one's hair is not an issue of modesty and going bareheaded is not a form of disrespect. In fact, the opposite is true. Uncovered hair is a woman's splendor, glory, beauty, and magnificence. And with uncovered hair, she is proud before her husband, her lover. The prohibition is uprooted on principle and is made permissible. When only a few traditional rabbis have reinterpreted the law of hair covering, throughout the generations, women have acted on their own initiative. The first sparks of rebellion occurred in the 1600s when French women began wearing wigs to cover their hair. Rabbis rejected this practice both because it resembled the contemporary non-Jewish style and because it was immodest in their eyes for women to sport a beautiful head of hair, even if it was a wig. However, the wig practice took hold, and perhaps ironically, it is common today in many Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox communities. In some of these communities, the custom is for women to wear an additional covering over their wig to ensure that no one mistakes it for natural hair.
So, to me, this is sort of the height of something. So you have a prohibition of a woman for showing her hair because it's erotic. So the solution is to cover her head with a beautiful wig. And then because that might also be erotic, you will have a additional covering, presumably not another wig, but a scarf over her hair. And I know in some Ashkenazi communities, actually even at a marriage, a woman's hair is shorn off and a wig is placed on her head. And you know, Sonia has a cousin in Casablanca who is the I guess is a senior or a major rabbi in Casablanca, and he's a Chabad rabbi. And we've had, you know, we spent time at his home for like a Shabbat, Saturday afternoon lunch. And you know, I remember vividly this woman, young woman, his wife, would take off her sheitel, her wig, because she's running around after the kids and so on. And I guess we were a family, and so her hair was, you know, very, very short, and not short in anything, at least in my view, approaching like stylish short. It was just, you know, cut short, because presumably she was wearing a wig out in public virtually all the time. It was a little shocking, and it's hot. Casablanca, you know, in the summer is hot, so it's another issue.
And it's amazing that at one time, a lot of these wigs, they would import from India and get the very dark, very straight hair there. And you know, you see all these women around Muncie with just perfectly, you know, humidity didn't affect anything. Just, you know, just straight hair, and you knew they were wearing wigs. And there was controversy many years ago that if the Indian women prayed, you know, in their religious institution, it invalidated the wigs that they were wearing.
Yeah, I don't know if what happened eventually, but I remember there were rulings against using wigs from India because they're basically they're idol worshippers, and so you're basically using, you know, wigs, that hair that was used in idol worship. So that was forbidden. And what was even worse was, because I mean, a lot of women had purchased these wigs, and they're not cheap. They're good wigs. I think are several $1,000s each.
Oh yeah, several thousand.
And they couldn't. The Jewish women who owned such wigs couldn't sell them because you couldn't benefit from idolatry. And I remember a ruling which I found particularly shocking, which said they couldn't even give them to like hospitals for cancer patients to use, because it would be sort of a mitzvah connected with idolatry. So it's yeah, pretty bizarre, at least in my view. Alan.
There must be rules about the material that could be used to make the wigs.
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I wouldn't doubt if you expose rabbis to it, there would be rules. So, you know, one question is, could it be, you know, completely artificial? I presume it wouldn't look very good if it was artificial, but I don't know. Okay, I think we're down here. Many women.
Oh, okay. Or was it as a general practice? Did we do that?
Okay, I don't know. No,
I-
no, I think you're right.
Yeah. As the general practice of covering one's head in public faded in Western culture in the past century, many Orthodox women also began to go bareheaded. Despite rabbinic opinions to the contrary, these women thought of hair covering as a matter of custom and culture. Many women who continue to cover their hair do not do so for the traditional reason of modesty. For example, some women view head covering as a sign of their marital status and therefore do not cover their hair in their own home. Others wear only a small symbolic head covering while showing much of their hair. Also, in many communities, women have persisted in covering their hair only in synagogue. In recent decades, there is an interesting trend among women who have learned the Jewish legal sources for themselves due to advance in women's education and have decided to adopt a stringent stance toward hair covering rather than following the more permissive norms of their parents' communities. An entire book, Hide and Seek, tells these women's stories. Modesty as a Jewish value is continually being refined and redefined by Jewish women and their communities. Just as some women have chosen to de-emphasize hair covering as a marker of modesty, in other communities, women may choose to embrace it, developing and reinforcing a more traditional communal norm. As modesty is subjectively defined, the community to which one wishes to belong may play a large role in determining practice. The decision to cover one's hair rests at the crossroads between law and custom, personal choice, and community identification.
And then there's, as my Jewish learning often does, they will direct you to other articles. And one other thing which I'd like to just point out, and I think we see it, in lots of places, is ultimately the people rule. I would say, what do the Jews do in contrast to what do rabbis try to make them do? And we see lots of examples, there's clearly examples on both sides of where modern custom or, developing customs and standards and norms supplant what might at one time have been traditional rules. And there are places where the rabbis have tried to do things or tried to resist things, and people are doing them, and ultimately the people wind up I would say broadly speaking, ruling, but change isn't necessarily rapid. Okay, I am going to jump to the other article, and maybe I will take my turn in reading. So this is actually a series. I don't know if they mentioned. There were about 4 or 5 articles from the Jerusalem Post in November of 2022, and you can search for them actually by this woman's name, and you all have it, from the article I sent. And so at one point I was going to read several of them, but they were quite detailed. But I thought this one had some points that were not covered in the other one. So here's the sages ask Kimchi how she met. Oh, that was the woman whose all of her sons were high priests. And I actually don't understand that, because to my knowledge, you only have one high priest at a time. So I don't understand how all of her sons could have been high priests, but that's another issue.
What time period is this whole priest
Well,
referring?
if we're talking high priest, we're talking about the time when the temple stood.
Okay.
So it would have been before the year 70.
Okay.
One of the most prevalent informal explanations given for the halachic mandate of head covering is that after the wedding ceremony, a woman's hair becomes a type of nakedness, erva, to be seen only by her husband and associated with their sexual intimacy. In the previous columns, rabbinic texts were cited and analyzed regarding the practice of women's head covering, yet nowhere in those discussions was hair referenced as erva. So how did the concept that a married woman's hair is erva become a dominant part of the halakhic discourse? And some of this we've already seen in Berachot, which is a tractate of Talmud, and Berachot means blessing. So in theory, it's about blessings. Rav Sheshet said, hair in a woman is erva, as it is written in the Song of Songs, your hair is like a flock of goats. The statement by Rav Sheshet that hair is erva appears only once in the Babylonian Talmud. It is not repeated or referenced anywhere in Tannaitic sources or in the Jerusalem Talmud, and it does not lead to any further discussion. Although many sources indicate that married women covered their heads and wore hair ornaments and accessories, it is significant that none of those sources reference Rav Sheshet's statement that hair is erva. Here's some wig salon in Jerusalem. Introducing Kimchit and the Zohar. So this is the other story we heard. Head covering is based on Dat Yehudit, Jewish practice, that does not specify that all hair must be covered. It also differentiates between head covering in private space and the marketplace. The 13th century Zohar makes no such distinction and introduces an unprecedented and uniquely stringent position in requiring that no hair ever be uncovered on the head of a married woman, even in the privacy of her own home. this position did not become normative immediately, but over the course of history, its impact on halakha is impossible to ignore, and it gradually became presented as the ideal in more strictly observant communities. The inspiration for the Zohar's stringent approach seems to come from the Talmudic passage about a woman named Kimchit, who appears in the Talmud as follows. It was taught in a Baraita. So a Baraita is an old part of Talmudic text, the same age as the Mishnah, if those words mean anything to you. You can always spot them because they're Hebrew and not Aramaic when you're reading the text, but it's part of Mishnaic legal material and stories that didn't actually make it into the Mishnah. So it was taught in one of these Baraitas that Kimchit had 7 sons and all served as high priests. The sages asked how she merited this, and she answered, "The walls of my house have never seen the hairs of my head." They said to her, "Many have done so without benefiting." My guess is, well, actually, that's let's see what the text says. The response of the sages in Kimchit is startling. They are not impressed with her excessive piety, nor do they validate it by suggesting that all women behave in a similar way. Nonetheless, the Zohar is clearly referencing this passage when it requires that a woman must not allow even the walls of her house to see a single hair of her head. So it's worth mentioning, not everybody may be familiar with this, but the Zohar is the central text of Jewish mysticism. It is, well, at least in this article, they make it clear that it's, I think 13th century Zohar. That is what the scholars understand, that the Zohar was written in the 1400s. The Zohar itself claims that it was written in the 2nd or 3rd century. So this material is fairly late, and it would be central to Kabbalah. And I always say Kabbalah is Judaism on steroids. It's how do you start with orthodoxy and then get more and more, you could say, observant or detailed or passionate in your observance to get even closer and closer to God.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wouldn't have described Kabbalah that way. I thought it was like a mysticism layer above normative Judaism.
Yes, I would agree with that.
But the steroids connote something, I guess, different.
So steroids is very much a cultural thing, which can denote different things to different people. So what I would say by that, I mean a Kabbalist begins by being an observant Orthodox Jew. And then the question is, what practices can I deepen to discipline my practice and orthodoxy so that I become closer and closer to God?
So they created, I can say invented, but decided to do things like the 10 Sfirot. Is that what they're called? The different functions, and that introduced some feminine qualities.
Except I wouldn't describe them doing the Sfirot. The Sfirot is an attempt to understand the nature of God.
Along what you said, they're trying to understand deeper than.
Yeah. But then the question would be, in their prayers and in their practices, would they use the Sfirot in a way to deepen their practices? So in the 49-day counting of the Omer, you have a matrix of the 7 lower Sfirot across the top and the 7 lower Sfirot across the bottom. And every day you analyze the intersection of those 2 Sfirot and meditate and contemplate what it means to your life.
So I know you won't get off this too far, but the feminine dimension always interests me because that's not fundamental patriarchal Judaism, but the L'cha Dodi, where we refer to the bride,
Mm-hmm.
Is that origin in the Kabbalah thinking of that period?
That is like a 15th or 16th century poem and I think it's connected with the Kabbalists in Sfat.
Yeah, I thought so. That's what I thought.
Yes.
That's why
but one of the main and very interesting elements of Kabbalah is that it describes the attachment between people and God, and even the various aspects of God's nature. That yearning and attachment and attraction is one of the ways of indicating how powerful it is to use sexual language. So the yearning of the Jews for Shabbat is like a bridegroom yearning for his bride on their wedding night, which is clearly a sexual reference.
Would
And
that
in
be,
a lot of the Kabbalistic imagery, even the yearning of the male and female aspects of God is described quite graphically and sexually.
would that be considered in the list of many things that when we try to understand God, we think of anthropomorphic, the idea of the human side of,
Yes.
the
Yes.
image. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So one of the things I would say is that the rationalists like Maimonides would say, dump the anthropomorphisms. God is purely spiritual, purely thought, and anything that you try and say about God is blasphemy because you're limiting God by using an image. My sense of Kabbalah is that the Kabbalists go overboard in the opposite direction. Not only are we going to describe God in anthropomorphic terms, but we're going to go overboard and we'll describe it in 500 anthropomorphic terms.
Thank you.
So and I kind of like that. Well, I like it very much, actually. Yes, Alana.
I have a question. What would you say is the role then of being created in God's image?
If we say what was created in God's image?
People.
Yes. So that's a hint. And that's where the Sfirot and these discussions will begin. When it says God created humanity, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and the image and a word that's Tselem also means shadow, which is another whole interesting discussion. So if you say that God created humanity in God's image, one of the questions you can start thinking about is, what does that say about the nature of humanity? And what does that say about the nature of God? So one of the things, I don't know, Alana, if you're familiar with, what Alan was talking about with the Sfirot of Kabbalah. So it looks like a person. I mean, it has a right side, a left side, it has a phallus, it has a womb, it has a head, it has a crown, and so on. So the Kabbalists are beginning there, and they're going deeper and deeper and deeper. But you're absolutely right. It's beginning with this idea that if God created us in the divine image, then in some sense, God's image must resemble our image. Okay, so let's see. Okay, let me continue. I don't know where we'll get through this tonight, probably. The response of the sages to Kimchit is startling. They are not impressed with her excessive piety. Oh, we read that. Yes. In some Hasidic communities, it serves to this day as motive for complete. I think I read that too. It serves as a motive for her completely shaving off her hair after a wedding to ensure there's never a possibility of protruding hairs outside of the head covering. Okay, the response of Maharam al-Shachar, Rabbi Moses, son of Isaac al-Shachar, with that name, who lived in the 15th and 16th centuries and served communities in Tunisia, Greece, and Cairo, wrote a responsum about married women who uncovered some of their hair, in which he rejected the stringent approach of the Zohar as standard practice. Maharam al-Shachar explained in his lengthy responsum that the definition of erva depends largely on the behavioral norms of a given community. And again, that highlights an element of Jewish law in more detail than what I said before. But if you're living in a Jewish community and you have a question, normally you would submit it to your rabbi. And if the rabbi feels it's beyond Orthodox, his ability to make a decision, he would submit it to a scholar who would write a responsum. The question in Hebrew is called the she'olah, and the response in Hebrew is called the tshuva, and it's always called responsa a responsible literature. So what's going on here is questions are being posed, and Jewish law for those communities, Tunisia, Greek, and Cairo, are being changed. That wouldn't necessarily affect a Jew living in Poland in the 15th and 16th century. Yeah, Alan.
That word you use for the responsive, is it connected to the word return in tshuva that we use?
Yeah, basically, you ask a question, and this is the response.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, so yeah, we talk about tshuva as repentance because you're turning back to the path, but a tshuva also is, simply a response to a question.
Thank you.
Nonetheless, there was a move in the following centuries in some communities toward greater stringency due to the erva consideration. Notably, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, known as the Chatam Sofer, who lived in the 18th century, wrote that while the Zohar is not halacha, it has uprooted halacha in firmly defining that women should cover all their hair all the time. While he connected that according to halacha, as understood in the Talmud and Rishonim, the practice of women and how much they cover determines what hair is erva. In fact, the custom based on the Zohar supplants the straightforward halacha. This is consistent with the Chatam Sofer's attitude in general that custom ultimately determines halacha, even if it replaces or uproots a more straightforward or earlier understanding of halacha. Getting a little bit into the depths of these discussions. The Age of Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment brought about many changes, among them changes to women's fashion. It became the norm in general society for married women to be seen in public with their heads uncovered and their hair loose. In Jewish community, women began to follow the local fashions and stopped covering their hair after marriage. This posed a challenge to rabbinic authorities. Were these women flouting halacha, or should halacha reflect the changed reality? The Mishnah in Ketubot, as outlined in an earlier column, referred to a woman's obligation to cover her hair as dat Yehudit, meaning Jewish custom and practice. A man could even divorce his wife if she did not conform. But what if she uncovered her hair in conformity with what had become acceptable Jewish practice? 19th century halachic compendiums began to acknowledge the actuality of observant women uncovering their heads in both Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. One position that emerged in Rabbi Yechiel Michel Epstein's Aruch al Shulchan in the 19th century was that although women have an ongoing obligation to cover their hair once married, the habituation of seeing women's hair causes it to cease being erva even when reciting the Shema! Exclamation point. Rabbi Israel Meyer Kagan, author of the Mishnah Brura, in contrast, remains steadfast in his position that a married woman's hair remains eternally erva. In another part of the world, Rabbi Yosef Chaim, known as the Ben Ish Chai in Baghdad, wrote about pious, modest women who uncover their heads and wonders if they're transgressing. He puts forward a justification in defense of those women by equating their hair to uncovered hands and faces which do not cause any sort of sexual stimulation. Rabbi Joseph Messas in Morocco argued halachically that if women are uncovering their heads, then they have redefined dat Yehudi, and thus there is no longer a transgression associated with a woman's bare head. It is interesting that across the Jewish world from Baghdad to Belarus and Lithuania, women began uncovering their hair following contemporary styles and acceptance among non-Jewish women. As we will see, there was a shift back toward obligation and erva in the 20th century. And then she talks about what she's going to talk about in the next column, which I did not distribute. Okay, good, we got through this. So, yeah, I found it interesting because it is such a mark for me of the Hasidic world, and I never really had the opportunity to take a close look at what's going on there. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And I'm going to take a look at that.
It's a Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah, it's Shulchan Aruch. Evan,
You probably have a book like that, but I don't know. I don't have that.
I actually don't have a complete Shulchan Aruch. It was really interesting. When I was a rabbinic student, which was, like 25 years ago, there was not to be found an English translation of the Shulchan Aruch.
Right.
It was never translated because of the understanding that if you're the kind of person who is actually consulting the Shulchan Aruch, you know how to read Hebrew.
And that was a reform seminary. That's interesting.
Well, I didn't limit my searching to a Reform seminary.
Okay.
I was then the master of, if there was a translation somewhere, I would find it because my Hebrew is never fantastic. So I
This
would
is
always,
a little tangent, but I have a friend at the Rachman Center at Bar-Ilan University Law School, and when she made Aliyah, she wasn't that good with Hebrew. In order to go through law school, she did sort of what you said. She had to have these translation books because all her classes were in Hebrew, and it forced her to learn enough Hebrew. It was just because of something you're discussing. Is that she
how
had
long
to
ago was this?
15 years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because now, with Safaria and even Google Translate, I mean, it's really pretty easy to find even obscure texts that you can get translated.
Well, she's proud of the fact I mean, it became an obligation, but she was disclosing the challenge of learning Hebrew as a
Yes.
recent immigrant, and she's 40 something now, and she's not.
Yeah, and it's a huge issue in Israel for Westerners, say, making Aliyah to learn Hebrew. And I remember, working a lot with Israeli companies and Americans who made Aliyah, and the kids are growing up in Israel, and in the exact reversal of what my parents did, where they would speak Yiddish to each other, so we wouldn't understand. This guy would say his kids would speak Hebrew to each other, quickly, so the parents wouldn't understand.
My mother would apologize talking to my grandmother when she wanted to do that, so I wouldn't understand.
Yep. So it's language is very interesting. But now, now there's a lot of translations, and I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if Safaria. I never looked to see if Safaria has the Shulchan Aruch because it's quite detailed.
They have everything. I bet they do.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it interesting. And I don't know what we're going to do next time, but I'll figure it out and get an email out in the next day or so.
Awesome. Very good.
And then Wednesday we're discussing, I don't remember what.
In between.
Fear versus love, right?
What? Oh,
Wasn't it
yeah.
fear versus love?
The tension between fearing God and loving God. And it's been a while since I found that article.
Are you going to avoid next week to have a Monday and a Wednesday on either side of the election and still avoid the election?
Yeah, so I'm definitely going to be wrapped up in the election, and
it's okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if on Wednesday we're all sitting still in front of our screens while a bunch of various people are at their versions of the magic wall, analyzing county by county what's going on in the Electoral College. So
tell that it's on my mind and probably everybody else's mind.
So with that happy thought in mind, I will wish you all a good evening and see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good evening.
Thanks for all that you do, Rabbi.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad you're with us.
Thank you, readers, all you people who read. You did a great job, including the rabbi, but thank you, Joanne, as always, and Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, Rabbi, you should be recognized for all of your your ability to expand on so many topics. It's just,
thank you. It sort of surprises and shocks me how much I remember about this sort of obscure stuff. Whereas I can't remember where I put my keys. I don't remember people's names. I wouldn't notice, what if Sonia completely redecorated, unless she moved the chair that I usually sit in, I probably wouldn't notice it. I mean, it's really shocking and dismaying how much I I don't know, but for some reason, this stuff I really love.
But I
You-
thought about this because I wonder how many rabbis conduct classes like this, like with so many topics. They just keep coming.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn, as it turns out, and I
Yeah.
always manage to come up with something.
I
And
know.
rather than prepare a class, I take the out of reading an article together,
Mhm.
and then I think I like it because we get the benefit of everyone's comments on the article.
Mhm.
And I've had people, from my group at Adat Elohim who don't participate because their attitude basically is, well, if I have the article, why do I have to come and listen to, people read it? But to
Right.
me, a lot of the interesting part are the digressions and reactions and questions, and so
Yeah,
So-
people get to share their,
I like that.
To your
Yeah.
your response, Rabbi, to Joanne's comment about you knowing a lot, it reminds me of a storyteller. Her name is Vicky Udich. She's still around doing storytelling. And while she's telling her story about how she became Jewish and converted, and she heard about this school, which has not been renamed, called the University of Judaism. This goes way back. And the response to the person who told her, he said, there's a university for Judaism, and she says, there's a lot to learn.
Mhm.
Yep.
There it is.
Okay, well, take care, and
You too. Have a
see
good
you
evening.
next time.